Welcome, my friends, to your set of videos for Unit 2. Make sure you understand what your video homework type is, and I'll see you at the end of the notes. Wow, this is Unit 2. Oh my gosh, You're about to embark on Unit 2 videos with Miss I. Get ready, cause it's gonna be awkward and... Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started with our topic, which is the early development of Greek society. So our objectives with this video, once again, how do you determine that something is classical? What was ancient Greece able to develop, or excuse me, how was ancient Greece able to develop various city-states, and what effect did Greece have on their world? Let's go ahead and get started with the early development. Humans inhabited this Balkan Mediterranean region from an extremely early date, but historians can't really specify what that date is because we don't have the records for it. But by the 3rd millennium BCE, a lot of these individuals were meeting with one another from different societies. They were traveling and trading all over the Mediterranean basin. And the early inhabitants built their societies under the influence of Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, and others who were in the area. So we know of 2 specific types of societies. So that's what we're going to be focusing on here today. We have the Minoan and the Mycenaean societies. We're going to go ahead and start with the Minoan societies by looking at their capital of Knossos. I believe, I have a picture right here. So we are looking at this island called Crete and the capital of Knossos. So between 2000 and 1700 BCE, there was this very sophisticated society on this island who built very lavish palaces all throughout the lands. And their palaces, the reason why they created them, was this was essentially their central nervous centers of their society, where either that was the ruler's residence, it was a storehouse, these palaces kept detailed records, etc. So these palaces were incredibly important for us to understand and know about this society. And they centered their economy and their lives all around commerce, aka trading, specifically trading with the Greek peninsula, with Anatolia, Phoenicia, Egypt, etc. So this is kind of where we are looking at right now. But obviously they declined. About after 1700 BC, there's a lot of various natural disasters that happened in the area, whether it was earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or tidal waves. And after that ginormous blow, about 300 years later, there were very wealthy individuals on this island, and they started to attract invaders. And so thus, Crete fell underneath the foreign domination. But then moving on to this other society, the Mycenaean society, they were originally these Indo-European peoples, much like what we looked at with India, for example. And they came into this Greek peninsula that you see here. And they started to trade with the MINOANs and adapted their writing system to start slowly create this early form of Greek language. But right when the MINOANs started to collapse, the Mycenaeans started to build this pretty large structure on the mainland, which they dubbed Peloponnesus. And this fortification offered protection and it attracted settlers who built small agricultural community, thus overpowering their brethren society. So beginning about 1200 BCE, the Mycenaeans engaged in a conflict with the city of Troy and Anatolia, which thus created the Trojan Wars, which was documented, or at least the story was told by a man named Homer with his story of the Iliad. And this coincided with invasions of foreign mariners in the Mycenaean homeland. Right here is just a map to kind of pinpoint where things are. Troy is right over here, and the Mycenaeans would have been right over here at this point. So between 1100 to 800 BCE, there's a lot of chaos all throughout the eastern part of the Mediterranean, aka where Anatolia is. There's a lot of invasions and civil disturbances that made it impossible to maintain a stable government or to even continue to have a productive agricultural society. And thus population fell sharply, whether it was because individuals were trying to move to a better place or they just died out. And this is a direct reflection of what Homer was creating with both of his works of the Iliad and the Odyssey. You might have read or heard about it in your English classes. It essentially reflects the tumultuous centuries that were happening in this time. It's a portrayal of society that's filled with conflict and recounts innumerable episodes of aggression, treachery, and violence, alongside, however, with heroic bravery and courage. So, in other words, these stories that Homer was creating was not only a reflection of the terror that the individuals were feeling, but also a way to kind of boost up morale by trying to gather as many people to fight back and be that brave hero. In the absence of a centralized state or an empire, you have these local institutions that started to restore political order in Greece. And these institutions are called city-states or a polis. These are the most important institutions when you talk about ancient Greece. They offered a fortified site that gave a refuge to local communities during times of war and other emergencies, attracted a lot of people, thus creating this urban type of society that extended their authority over surrounding regions, where they started to tax people as well as appropriate or give out land to individuals. They essentially functioned as little mini countries. And they took various political forms as well. So not all of these city-states were authoritarian or ruled by a small monarchy, right? Rule of one. Some of them were an oligarchy, a rule of a few or a little mini council, as well as some were tyrants, which during this time, a tyrant wasn't necessarily a bad individual. A tyrant usually referred to a rule of a general or a rule of an ambitious politician. So it wasn't, once again, necessarily a bad thing to be a tyrant in ancient Greece. And with these polises, we're going to be looking at two very famous and specific ones. The first one is Sparta, which is on Peloponnesus. And the next one is Athens, which is on Attica. But we're going to go ahead and start with ancient Sparta. So looking at Sparta as a whole, as the population and economy started to expand, they reacted by extending their control all over the Peloponnesus land, to the point where they started to reduce their neighboring peoples to the status of a helot, which are servants of the Spartan state. They weren't chattel slaves, but they weren't free either. Right? So they weren't chained to do their duties, and yet they couldn't run away. Their main role was to provide an agricultural labor, as well as to keep Sparta's food supply up and running. By 500 BCE, the helots probably outnumbered the Spartan citizens by more than 10 to 1, which is an astounding number to think about, which meant that having a large subject population increased the ability to cultivate the Peloponnesus land, but it means that the Spartans faced constant threat of rebellion. And their number one resource during this time would have been maintaining a very powerful and disciplined military society. That was essentially their main government focus. So looking at this military society, so in theory, Spartan citizens were equal in status. They discouraged the development of economic and social distinctions. So they didn't really have any jewelry or elaborate clothing, as well as luxuries or private wealth. And even their money, for example, they didn't have very specific coins. They just had iron bars to show their wealth. So they're really trying to say that there was no better individual through wealth or through appearance. The only true social distinction would have been your prowess, your discipline, and your military talent. And that is reflected through their educational system. So for boys, their education would start at the age of 7, where they were forced to live in military barracks to prove their strength by fighting various either animals or their own colleagues, etc. And by age 20, they had to have an active military service until their retirement, which would have been around age 60. The girls, on the other hand, did receive some form of education, where they specifically had a very rigorous physical education in hopes of creating strong children. So women were expected to be very fit, lean, and active. For girls, by the age of 18 to 20, they started to marry and have children, but they were living separately from their husbands because obviously their husbands had to continue through their military services. So the girls would hardly ever see their husbands, and they would be at home taking care of the lands as well as their children. So moving on to Athens. So for Athens, how they responded to a population and economy that was expanding, they decided to establish a government based on democratic principles. They would negotiate order by considering the interests of the polis's various citizens. And a citizen was a very key definition during this time. You could only be a citizen if you were a free male adult from Athens. You had absolutely no voice if you were a foreigner, if you were a slave, or if you were a woman. They would resolve social problems by opening government offices to all free male citizens and try to have as much active participation as possible within their political realm. So looking at Athenian society, by about 600 BCE, there was an increase of trade throughout the Mediterranean basin, or maritime trade. There was a lot of peace around Attica and the regions in Athens. And those who benefited the most of this trade were the aristocratic landowners. They essentially, during this time, controlled the Athenian government. With their growing wealth came their growing power. And by 500 BCE, Attica had a large and growing class of extremely unhappy people with the structure of their society, and they were ready to fight each other. Well, there's one aristocrat named Solon who served as a mediator between the various classes, and he thought of a solution to this class conflict. This is him right here. Wow, what a guy. He essentially created a promise between the classes where he said aristocrats are allowed to keep their lands. However, they had to cancel any debts, any debt slavery, as well as liberating those who are already enslaved for debt. To make sure that this would all work, Solon provided representation for the common classes in the Athenian government. And later, the Athenian leaders increased opportunities for commoners to participate in government, and they paid salaries to office holders so that financial hardships would not exclude anyone from service. So looking at Greek colonization, which started around 800 BCE. So the policies were emerging as centers of political organization in Greece. And with this increasing population came a strain in resources that were available. And the only solution during this time would have been to establish or to create colonies on other parts of the Mediterranean. And this had a pretty ginormous effect on ancient Greece as a whole. Not only did it create more communication, interaction, and trade all over the Mediterranean, but it started to spread this Greek language and Greek culture. Greek culture was specifically focusing on a quick tempo social life. And as Greek merchants were coming in, they were bringing this new found of wealth, specifically to local clan leaders from smaller states. And that is where we're going to end it for today. So what do we learn? Classical Greece, or classical Greek life, is seen as classical based on their focus on city-states and their governmental styles. City-states were only able to develop by having mass chaos as their precursor. And with that chaos, there was a need for individual city-states. And then lastly, ancient Greece had a profound impact on their world, primarily through trade and culture. That was some pretty inspirational stuff, right? Make sure that you understand what your homework type is. And if you have any questions, you know exactly how to reach me. Goodbye, good luck, and I'll see you next time.